Hi, this is Paul Malutnak again, and we are studying chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. This is part 2, and we will begin this part and finish off the chapter in verses 9. So let me read verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. So the bulk of this chapter starts in verse 9 and gives us a definition of the nature of the final world economy. The first one is introduced in verse 9, and the kings of the earth. This is the first group singled out, the world leaders. Kings meaning world leaders, presidents, premiers, generals, whatever they might be called. They committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her. This is not speaking necessarily of some physical immorality with a harlot or prostitute. This is talking about illicit, immoral engagement with the Antichrist world system, which is 180 degrees from God. Okay, so when you're not putting God first, when you're turning away from God, you are acting as a harlot. You are finding something else to take the place of God. And so those leaders who got swept up with Antichrist, those leaders became part of the whole movement, power and authority of the world, are loving every minute of it. And their sensual desires are being fulfilled, pursuing all the materialistic ends, who have been exalted and become proud, self-sufficient, and boastful. Those leaders who lived sensuously will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. Interesting that is located in what once was the region of the Garden of Eden, the very center of the world, where God began his creation, and that's Babylon, and where he may bring his final devastation to that. One person said that Babylon is actually very close to the center of the mass geography of the entire globe. And it could be Babylon, the actual city. It could be Rome. There are arguments made for several different places. But the place isn't that important. What's most important is that it's the system, and it's controlled by Antichrist. As the capital of Antichrist, world's governments receive a fatal blow to the head, the brains, the control center of the world economy. The great leaders who make it all happen realize that it's coming down all around them. The kings who committed these acts of immorality, living sensuously, the Antichrist system, where it said the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality. They're mentioned in verse 3. They're mentioned in chapter 17. The kings of the earth, again, committed acts of immorality. Let's look at verse 10. They will stand far off in fear of their torment and say, "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." Again, this means to indicate that we may well be, this judgment hits initially on the very city, whichever city that is, the core. It might even be the computer center of the world economy, and the city burns before the destruction of everything else comes. Their leaders scattered all over the world, working for this one world government under Antichrist, and they see it going down in flames. How could they do that? How could they see all across the world? Might be television. There's a lot of ways, and even more in that day, electronics and communication systems. Armies could even be on their way to Armageddon by this time. Their world leaders realize, however, that it's all coming down, and they say, "Woe, woe," or "Alas, alas, the great city Babylon, the strong city, in 1 hour your judgment has come." not only do the leaders realize that everything's coming down and they're going to lose everything they've worked so hard to gain. We're going to look at verse 11 here. These people would be the people who are making money off the system. They're not getting as wealthy as the leaders are, but it would include the merchants, the buyers and sellers, the businessmen, the stockbrokers, the people that handle money. All the merchants of the earth are going to mourn over her because no one buys their stuff anymore, and they're losing money now. Let's look at verse 11, 12, and 13. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple, cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls also. And so John lists 28 categories of goods. They weep because there's no more market for it anymore. You can't sell it. Fragrant plants used for perfume under the term spice, made from seeds of, by the way, an eastern shrub in India and Africa, were also used to put in the hair. Frankincense, a gum resin used as a fragrance in southern Arabia. Chariots, literally, the word means a four-wheeled wagon. The workforce, nobody wants to hire anymore. Nobody will work. Business comes grinding to a halt. Perhaps there's a great business center going on in Babylon. Perhaps this speaks of just one large segment of the world economy feeling the first wave of judgment. It's interesting to note the union, I think, the merchants and kings wailing over the destruction of Babylon. In ancient times, government and business were not quite as united as they will be, and as they even are today. Some study of history, remind yourself that kings ruled apart. Kings were, and they lived in another world altogether, apart from those who carried on the business of the world. Business and government were separate. And business and government, as far as we know it, you can't even find that separating line. Talk about the value chain of manufacturing goods and so forth. You make a lot of money in your business and the government will surely take half of it. They're all wailing. They're all in this together in this system. The government and the economy of the world is all one. We'll have a world economy run by a world government, and they're all moving in that direction even today. Government is absorbing more and more of private enterprise, and they will weep over the loss of their luxuries. The fruit, let's go on to the next verse 14. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all of your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. So verse 14 says, and the fruit you long for is gone from you. Fruit meaning possessions, luxuries, wealth, everything. The whole system is bankrupt. It's all lost. And it says all things that were luxuries and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. So as the judgments come, they get poured out in further devastation. As the days and weeks go by, everything is lost. This, by the way, just a footnote here, is the beginning of hell. When you think about hell, what do you think of? You think of the torment of lusting and never possessing. Lusting but never being satisfied. That could be an indicator of hell. Lusting. People in hell aren't going to long for righteousness. People in hell aren't going to long for goodness and godliness. They're not going to long for virtue or for blessing. They're going to lust for the same things that they lusted for when they lived on earth. And that's what you begin to see here. They'll lust for it, but it won't be there. Let's go verse 15. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Verse 15 talks about those people who become rich from her, the merchants. They're going to try to distance themselves, maybe to protect themselves in some way. And they'll start crying and weeping, and they'll never stop forever, because soon after this, Christ is going to come and destroy all of the ungodly, and they will be cast into the lake of fire to weep, wail, and gnash their teeth forever. And they weep and they wail because they want to go to heaven, but not because they want to go to heaven, but because they want their lusts filled, and they'll never be filled. Let's look at verse 16. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. And just like the kings in verse 16, the merchants say, woe, woe, the opposite of blessing, or alas, alas. It all comes down. There's a third group, not just the leaders, not just the merchants and the people that have the money, but the salesmen, the distributors are mentioned as group 3 here in verse 17. Let's look at that. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. All the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off. In verse 17, the middle of the verse, it says every shipmaster, every passenger, every sailor, all those traveling salesmen, people who run the transportation industry, engaged in sales and distribution, all those who sell and distribute goods, as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance. Again, they're trying to avoid the initial flurry of judgment. In verse 18, it says, and they cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they're crying out. And as they look at the smoke of the burning, and they say, like what other city was like this? There was never a city like this, with merchandise and beauty and all these things that we've been able to manufacture and distribute and sell. Bottom line is that they're saying, if this city can't survive, nothing's going to survive. This was the strongest city. And it could be, rebuilt Babylon. It could be whatever that Babylonish kind of city was. It could be a different city, but they would look at that city and they would say, if this city can't stand, nothing could. And then in a typical ancient expression of grief, John sees these mourners do what many have done in times of grief. Verse 19, it says, and they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by their wealth, for in a single hour she has been laid waste. So they threw dust on their heads. And you might find that in Israel today. Jews that mourn, they'll rip their garments, they'll throw dust on their heads, they'll cry out and weep and mourn. Woe, woe, the great city which has had ships became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. They're all going to see that. The world's going to see it. Whether you're a leader, whether you're involved in the business world, whether you're a sailor, shipper, distributor, salesperson, whatever you are, the universal pain and grief, there will be no repentance. There's woe is Babylon. There's no woe is me. All of their hopes, their dreams were built on this Antichrist system, and they thought it could endure, and they thought it was stronger than God. And like I said, many may be on their way to Armageddon at this point. Let's look at verse 20. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. So now we have this contrast here. It's striking. Now all of a sudden enjoyment comes. Verse 20 may seem different or unusual, but what is it saying? It's saying rejoice. It's now talking to the saved people. It's talking to the church that's been raptured. It's talking to the martyrs that were under the altar. It's talking even to the saved that lasted out the devastations there in the tribulation. Rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her, against Babylon, against that system, against all the people that earth dwellers, if you will. It was the saints and apostles and prophets that were pleading with God to bring about an end to sin, to bring about that the judgment in the last days, and to give glory to God for that. So now you can rejoice, O heaven. Who's that? The angels and the saints, the raptured. They've all been vindicated now. Here is God's vengeance. You can rejoice. And God said himself, I find no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And John himself said this whole thing was bitter in his mouth, though sweet in his heart, because he understood the vindication of God and the glory of God, and he hated to see God dishonored, and so do we. Let's look at verse 21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it in the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. So judgment's completed, won't be found any longer. It's a graphic object lesson. It's just going to be thrown down as if a great millstone was wrapped around it and thrown into the sea. It will disappear in the blackness of the sea. Jeremiah 51 verses 61 through 64 had the same imagery from Jeremiah. The final destruction of this world system will be like a millstone disappearing into the sea. There's no hole in the water as it sinks into the blackness, never to be seen again. Thus it says, will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and found no longer. And when the angel makes this announcement, here's what happens, verses 22 and 23. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of the lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. So we think of those two verses, the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters. You won't hear them anymore. Can you imagine a world without music? In the final day of man's day, the earth dweller's day, there will be no commerce, no industry, no music, no food, no songs. People won't be entertained. Nobody will want to play. There won't be any heart to play a harp. There won't be any motivation to play a flute, trumpet, or make any music. No craftsman or any craft will be found any longer. Nobody's going to make anything. The mills are going to be closed. Factories will be silent. No lights. And so the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not even be heard in you any longer. No happiness. Nobody's going to get married. There aren't going to be any weddings in those last terrible, terrifying weeks. There won't be any joy, no music, no marriages, no nothing. And Babylon literally seduced the world, had it under its control by Satan and the Antichrist. And the merchants were in charge of everything, and everything bowed down to capitalism. And everything will bow to materialism. And when it comes down, there's nothing left. There's no joy. There's no nothing. And let's look at verse 24. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of saints and of all those who have been slain on the earth. Why such a total destruction? The judgment is justified. That's the last point of all this. This deceived world, a God-rejecting world, the ones that rejected Christ, the corrupt leaders, the deceived people, those who murdered the saints. In chapter 19, verse 2, it says that God will bring judgment on the great harlot Babylon, and he will avenge the blood of his bondservants on her. The wicked world system will kill the saints. It will massacre the saints in a wholesale fashion. At the end of the age, believers will be slaughtered. In chapter 17, verse 6, it says that this woman, Babylon the Great, the religious form of the world empire, was drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. The false religious system will martyr true believers. The world government of Antichrist will slaughter true believers. That will be the final straw. And because she has on her blood, the blood of prophets and saints and all who've been slain on the earth, the Lord will bring his vengeance. We have a world economy and we have television for everybody to see these things. And if the Lord allows for us, for this to be set up in the city of Babylon, Babylon has been rebuilt by the Iraqis and by the way, now known as a bridal city. I don't know that the world is looking for someone who can preserve the world economy and bring prosperity to it, but the world has scientific capabilities it's never had, so it could stay production even under terrifying world-altering judgments such as occur in the book of Revelation. Don't know of anything that exists in our world that would disallow this from happening in our lifetime. It could happen. And we think of Luke chapter 12, 16 through 21. It says, and he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentiful. And then he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. I will store my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to them, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you prepared, those whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. This is the whole attitude in what Jesus was talking about in Luke 12. But God's going to say, you fool, this very night, your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Jesus warned everyone, don't put your faith in your treasures, in the material things or things of this world. During tribulation, many will be converted, and there'll be saints who will experience that horrifying reality, and by God's mercy will be delivered from judgment. But there will be many, perhaps, if this is going to happen in our lifetime, it's not hard to see many of these materialistic behaviors happening today. We're clearly living, at least in the United States, in an affluent society today. As we sometimes compare ourselves to perhaps wealthier neighbors, we see ourselves as more humble and meek and ordinary in our economic status. But The problem is we are wealthy. When you compare us to the world, our problem is that we love riches and the lifestyle more than we love God. Well, thank you for watching and listening to chapter 18 of Revelation. And please stay tuned, and we'll be coming back with chapter 19. Thank you, and may God bless you.